You left without paying last week, sir. Can you walk me through what happened?
Thought I did. Swiped the card, it beat. Didn't see no error.
The register canceled the transaction. Camera shows you
I'm
walking
just
out
trying
with
to
the
get your
bag.
side. I ain't stealing.
It was supposed to be an ordinary Saturday morning. No sirens. No arguments. No headlines waiting to be written. Just the quiet rhythm of a neighborhood convenience store as the day slowly began. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A coffee machine gurgled behind the counter. The automatic doors slid open and closed as customers came and went, buying snacks, newspapers, and groceries for the week ahead. At Shoplifting. M. A 78-year-old man stood alone at a self-checkout station. He moved carefully, deliberately, the way people do when their hands ache and their joints don't respond the way they used to. He placed his basket down, adjusted his reading glasses, and began scanning his items one by one. Milk. Beep. Bread. Beep. Eggs. Beep. Orange juice. Beep. Nothing rushed. Nothing hidden. Everything done in plain sight. Then, something didn't feel right. The total on the screen looked too low. Items he knew he had scanned were missing. He looked down at his bags, then back up at the screen. 6 items in his hands. 4 items on the display. He didn't walk away. He didn't try to pay less. He didn't pretend not to notice. He raised his hand and quietly asked for help. What happened next took less than 20 minutes and would change the way he saw his country forever. A store manager decided the system was right and the customer was wrong. A phone call was made. A patrol car arrived. And in front of strangers holding their phones, the elderly man was placed in handcuffs over $11 in groceries. Police would call it shoplifting. The store would say the register detected theft. But what no one stopped to ask was whether the machine could be wrong. And what no one seemed to notice was who that man in cuffs actually was. Because his name was James Thornton. And before that morning was over, a Vietnam War veteran would be sitting in the back of a police car, accused of stealing milk and eggs from a store he had shopped at for years. James Thornton was not confused. He was not lost. And he was not a thief. He was 78 years old. And every year of his life had been earned the hard way. Long before he stood in that convenience store, James had stood in places most people only read about in history books. In 1966, he was sent to Vietnam with the United States Army's 1st Cavalry Division. A young man dropped into a war that was already spiraling out of control. He fought through 2 full combat tours when the war was at its worst. He survived the Tet Offensive in 1968, when attacks erupted everywhere at once and nothing felt safe anymore. He fought in Hue City, where ancient streets turned into battlegrounds and young soldiers learned how quickly a life could end. During one mortar attack, shrapnel tore into his left leg. James kept fighting anyway, dragging 2 wounded soldiers to cover before allowing medics to treat him. For that, he was awarded the Purple Heart. A year later, his platoon was pinned down under heavy fire for hours. Extraction helicopters couldn't land. Ammunition was running low. James held his position, covering his unit's withdrawal almost alone until they could escape. That act of courage earned him a Bronze Star with valor. He didn't talk about it much afterward. Like many who survived, he learned to carry those memories quietly. When James came home in 1969, there were no parades waiting for him. No applause. No thanks. Instead, there were insults, accusations, and people who wanted nothing to do with the war or the men who fought it. He learned to keep his uniform in the closet and his service to himself. He learned to lower his voice, to avoid attention, and to build a life that stayed far away from trouble. For more than 50 years, that's exactly what he did. After the war, James Thornton did what so many veterans were forced to do. He started over from nothing. In 1974, he found steady work with the United States Postal Service, a job that didn't ask questions about the past and didn't care where you came from as long as you showed up and did the work. James showed up every day. For 35 years, he walked routes through heat, rain, and snow, carrying mail through neighborhoods that changed while he stayed the same quiet, dependable, and unnoticed. He married Martha, the woman who would stand beside him for the next 52 years. Together they built a modest life, 3 children, then grandchildren, then great-grandchildren, church every Sunday morning. A small house paid off slowly, one paycheck at a time. James never chased recognition. He didn't talk about medals or combat. He measured success by simpler things, keeping food on the table, showing up when his family needed him, staying out of trouble. When he retired at 65, his world grew smaller but steadier. A modest pension, Social Security, enough to live carefully, not extravagantly. He volunteered at the VA hospital, sitting with younger veterans who were still learning how to carry what war leaves behind. He joined the local VFW post, not to relive the past, but to make sure no one felt as alone as he once had. At 78, James's body showed the cost of time. Arthritis stiffened his hands, making small movements difficult. His hearing had been damaged decades earlier by artillery and helicopters. He walked with a slight limp from the shrapnel wound that never healed quite right. But his mind was clear. There was no confusion, no dementia, no fading awareness. He knew exactly who he was, exactly where he was, and exactly what he was doing when he walked into that store on Saturday morning. Every Saturday morning, James followed the same routine. At 10 o'clock, he drove his old Honda to the Fast Mart on Riverside Drive, parked close to the entrance so he wouldn't have to walk too far, and went inside with a short list Martha had written out for him: milk, bread, eggs, juice, maybe a little meat if it was on sale. Nothing extra, nothing wasted. Living on a fixed income had taught him to be careful. That morning was no different. The store had recently installed self-checkout machines, something James didn't care for. He preferred a cashier, preferred a human voice and a clear total at the end. But there was only one cashier working, and the line was long. The self-checkout stations were empty. After a moment's hesitation, James decided to use one. He had done it a few times before. It wasn't easy, but he could manage. He placed his basket down, took out his reading glasses, and began scanning. Each item made the same sound, a clean electronic beep. Each price appeared clearly on the screen. Milk scanned, eggs scanned, bread scanned, juice scanned. Nothing flashed red. Nothing told him to stop. The machine accepted everything he did. What James couldn't see was what was happening behind the screen. A software update installed the night before had introduced a bug into the system. Items were being scanned correctly, but some of them were being deleted from the transaction log before payment. To the customer, everything looked normal. To the system, the items never existed. When James reached the payment screen, the total was lower than expected. He frowned and looked down into his bags. 6 items. He looked back at the screen. 4 items listed. The milk and eggs were missing. James felt a flicker of concern, not fear. A mistake had been made. And, like any honest person, he believed it could be fixed. James didn't panic. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to leave. He did what he had done his entire life. When something went wrong, he asked for help. He looked around and caught the attention of a young cashier, politely explaining that something didn't seem right. He had scanned 6 items, but the screen only showed 4. He pointed to the milk and eggs in his bag. Then back to the display. The cashier glanced at the screen, then at the bags, and her expression shifted. To her, the system was clear. If the items weren't listed, they weren't scanned. She told him he must have missed them. James shook his head gently and repeated that he had heard the beeps, seen the prices, and placed the items in the bag after scanning them. The machine had accepted everything. The machine had to be wrong. She told him to scan the items again. James reached into the bag to pull out the milk, his stiff fingers fumbling with the plastic jug. As soon as he lifted it, the machine reacted. A red light flashed above the station. An alarm sounded. A message appeared on the screen warning of an unexpected item removed from the bagging area. The checkout locked itself. Suddenly, people were looking. Conversations stopped. James felt his face grow warm with embarrassment. The cashier returned, now irritated, telling him he wasn't allowed to remove items once they were scanned. James tried to explain that he was only doing what she had told him to do. He wasn't trying to take anything. He was trying to fix a mistake, but the system had already decided. The weight didn't match. The items didn't match the transaction. And in that moment, the assumption hardened into something else. This wasn't a technical problem anymore. To the people watching the screen, it looked like theft. The store manager was called over. His name was Derek Phillips, and he approached the situation with the practiced detachment of someone trained to follow policy, not instinct. He listened briefly as the cashier explained what the system showed. Items in the bag that weren't on the transaction, a locked register, a possible theft alert. Derek didn't ask James to explain from the beginning. He didn't check the system logs. He didn't rewind the security footage playing quietly above the aisles. He told James there was an issue with unpaid merchandise and asked him to come to the office. James felt his heart begin to pound. Unpaid merchandise. Theft. The words didn't fit the reality he knew. He told Derek, calmly but firmly, that he had scanned every item and that the machine had malfunctioned. He asked them to check the system. He asked them to look at the video. Derek shook his head. The system was working fine. He said, the policy was clear. James could either cooperate or the police would be called. James didn't refuse. He didn't argue. His leg ached. His hands trembled slightly. He walked to a bench near the entrance and sat down, trying to steady himself. Derek interpreted that pause as non-compliance. He stepped away and made the call. He told the dispatcher they had a customer refusing to cooperate with a theft investigation. James sat on that bench, listening to the words that would soon bring a patrol car to the parking lot. For the first time in decades, he felt the familiar weight of helplessness settle in his chest. Not fear, not anger, just the quiet realization that no one was listening to him anymore. The patrol car arrived at 1035 a.m. The sound of tires on pavement cut through the low hum of the store. Officer Brandon Cole stepped inside. Young, composed, already briefed by the manager before he ever spoke to James. To Cole, this wasn't a decorated veteran or a regular customer. It was a retail theft call. An elderly male, items not paid for, refusing to cooperate. James looked up as the officer approached. He spoke slowly, clearly, choosing his words with care. He told the officer he had scanned everything. He told him the machine had malfunctioned. He told him he tried to alert the staff before anything escalated. He pointed again to the bags, to the screen, to the missing items. Officer Cole listened just long enough to nod, then turned to Derek. The question was brief and procedural. Did the store want to press charges? Derek hesitated only for a moment. Company policy required prosecution to deter theft. Yes, he said. Press charges. The decision was made in seconds. Cole turned back to James and told him to stand up. James pushed himself up slowly, his joints protesting the movement. It took effort. It always did. The officer's voice sharpened, telling him to stand up now or he would assist him. James tried to explain. He wasn't refusing. He was 78 years old. When the officer reached for his arm, James flinched and pulled back instinctively. It wasn't defiance. It was reflex. But the moment was already framed differently in the officer's mind. Non-compliance. Resistance. Cole moved James's arms behind his back and applied the handcuffs. The metal closed tight around arthritic wrists. Pain shot through James's shoulders. He cried out, telling the officer he had arthritis, telling him he was hurting him. The response was flat. You should have cooperated. As customers watched and phones recorded, James Thornton was led toward the exit, limping, handcuffed, accused of stealing groceries he had tried to pay for. James was placed in the back of the patrol car, the door closing with a hollow thud that echoed louder than it should have. Through the window, he could still see the store, the self-checkout station, the blinking screen, customers stepping up to scan their items as if nothing had happened, life moving on without him. He sat in silence, his wrists aching, his leg throbbing, his mind replaying the moment again and again, searching for the point where everything went wrong. At the station, he was processed like any other suspect. His photograph was taken. His fingerprints were rolled onto an ink pad and pressed onto paper. Retail theft under $50. A misdemeanor. A citation with a court date 3 weeks away. The words sounded small, but the weight of them wasn't. James had never been arrested in his life. Not once. Not after war. Not after decades of work. Not ever. He was allowed one phone call. James dialed home with hands that still trembled. When Martha answered, he tried to keep his voice steady, but it broke anyway. He told her they had arrested him. He told her they said he stole milk and eggs. He told her the machine didn't work right. He asked her to call their son. Martha had stood by him through 52 years of life, but she had never heard her husband cry like that. Not when he came home from Vietnam. Not when friends died. Not when money was tight. That afternoon, when their son Robert arrived to pick him up, James said nothing during the drive. He stared out the window, watching familiar streets pass by, feeling something heavier than anger settle in. The slow, aching loss of dignity. That same afternoon, while James sat quietly in his living room, the story he had tried to tell finally began to surface. Other customers from the same Fast Mart location started calling to complain. They described the same problem. Items scanned. Beeps confirmed. Prices appeared. Then, at payment, items vanished. By evening, 7 separate complaints had been logged, all from that same day, all tied to the self-checkout machines. One complaint stood out. A woman named Jennifer Hayes had experienced the exact same malfunction just hours after James. She scanned 6 items. The screen showed 4. The system flagged a discrepancy. When she pointed it out, the manager apologized. He manually corrected the transaction. No accusations. No police. No handcuffs. She paid and left. On Monday morning, Fastmart's corporate office took notice. A regional manager ordered an internal review. System logs were pulled. Security footage was requested. The self-checkout vendor was contacted. Within 2 hours, the problem was identified. A software update installed the night before had introduced a synchronization error. Items were being scanned correctly, but randomly deleted from transaction records before payment. The video told the rest of the story. James scanning milk. Beep. Eggs. Beep. Each price clearly displayed. Each item bagged exactly as he described. He had done everything right. The machine had failed him. And when faced with that failure, the system had chosen the easiest explanation instead of the correct one. By the end of the day, Fastmart knew the truth. The register had been broken. The arrest should never have happened. But the damage had already been done. 8 weeks after the arrest, James finally left his house to meet with an attorney. His name was David Chin. And as James spoke, the quiet frustration in his voice carried more weight than anger ever could. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't dramatize. He simply explained what happened. Step by step. The way he had explained it in the store. The way no one had listened to before. David Chin listened. And the more he heard, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure at every level. The store had ignored its own safeguards. The employees had assumed theft instead of checking the system. The police had made an arrest without verifying the claim. And all of it had landed on a 78-year-old man who posed no threat to anyone. Fastmart's corporate representatives reached out first. They offered to drop the charge. They offered a written apology. They offered $500 for the inconvenience. James looked at the letter, then at the check, and slowly shook his head. Being handcuffed in public wasn't an inconvenience. Being treated like a criminal wasn't a misunderstanding. It was humiliation. The lawsuit was filed soon after. False arrest, elder abuse, negligence, civil rights violations, racial discrimination, emotional distress. The evidence was already there. System logs, security footage, witness statements, proof that other customers with the same problem had been treated differently. For the first time since the arrest, James felt something shift. Not relief, not closure, but the sense that the truth he had spoken from the beginning was finally being taken seriously. The case moved slowly, but it moved forward. Depositions revealed what the store had tried to minimize and what the police had failed to question. Internal emails showed Fastmart executives were aware of recurring issues with the self-checkout system weeks before James was arrested. Fixes had been delayed. Costs had been weighed. Customers had been left to absorb the consequences when the technology failed. The police reports didn't hold up either. Officer Cole had described James as agitated and resistant. The security footage showed an elderly man moving slowly, wincing in pain, trying to comply while struggling with his body. There was no aggression, no attempt to flee, no threat, just a man who couldn't move as fast as he was ordered to. As the evidence mounted, settlement talks began. The risk was too high. The facts were too clear. 15 months after the arrest, the agreement was finalized. $3.8 million. Compensation for false arrest. Physical pain. Emotional distress. Humiliation. And the reawakening of trauma James thought he had buried decades earlier. Discipline followed. The store manager was terminated. Employees were retrained. Officer Cole received a lengthy suspension and mandatory training on interacting with elderly and disabled individuals. Policies were rewritten. Technology had to be tested. Claims of system error had to be verified before police could be called. The money forced accountability. but it couldn't undo what had already happened. James Thornton never went back to that store. In fact, he stopped shopping alone altogether. Martha went with him now. Or their son did. He avoided self-checkout machines whenever he could. The sound of alarms made his chest tighten. The sight of flashing red lights brought back the feeling of metal cutting into arthritic wrists. At 78 years old, he learned that doing everything right does not always protect you. The settlement paid for counseling. It paid for medication to manage the anxiety that crept in afterward. It paid for accountability, policy changes, and training manuals rewritten in corporate offices and police departments. But it didn't give James back what he lost that Saturday morning in March. His sense of safety in public places, his trust that honesty would be enough, his belief that a lifetime of service had earned him basic respect. James had survived Vietnam. He had survived coming home to a country that rejected him. He had survived decades of quiet endurance. Working, raising a family, helping others without ever asking for recognition. And yet, it took one broken machine and a handful of assumptions to reduce him to a suspect, a statistic, a problem to be removed. Police called it shoplifting. The register was broken, and the man in cuffs was a Vietnam War veteran. This story isn't just about one arrest. It's about what happens when technology is treated as infallible and people are treated as disposable. When policy replaces judgment, when bias decides whose word is believed. So the question remains, when machines fail, who pays the price? Because if it can happen to James Thornton at 78 years old, after everything he endured and everything he gave, it can happen to anyone.